Today, we're going to get a little reflexive in that we're going to start out talking about a project that the bAIbes and special guest Simon put out last week called Australia 2032. And we want to situate this project of concern and imagination in the global dialogue, but also in the Prime Minister's speech last week, what's happened in the reaction since then, and why we think together is the right path forward.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
So before we get into what's in 2032 and kind of what's going on in the world right now around it, Cara, can you tell the story of kind of where the idea came from? Like what happened and why did we end up here?
So a few weeks ago, a group of researchers based in Europe developed Europe 2031. And it floored me. It was an absolutely beautiful piece. It was talking about the story of what has happened in European AI to date. But then what was actually really interesting about it was it then created this, fictional future. Yeah. Where if we continue down this path, what are the consistent ramifications that are happening? As somebody who's been deeply, deeply concerned by what's been happening inside sovereign AI opportunity, the kind of, just the aggregation of power happening, techno-feudalist kind of structures that are being put in place in America. Europe 2031 provided us with this really interesting insight as to what the next 5 years could look like inside Europe. And ultimately what it really came down was a warning about what was happening inside Europe, what this kind of disempowering and this lack of investment happening inside AI really does mean for industries, because it's not just the impact on the technology industry, it's what it is, the ripple effect across every single vertical that we have, because all these industries are being completely disrupted by AI. Now, I really think coming out of 2031, there's a few different provocations, but there's obviously the defense capability. What does that mean? What does the access to frontier tech mean in those instances? Yeah. But what I find really interesting is the impact inside the defense sphere as well, because what that means if there's a system that's able to, create cyber risk, and then allies who have been part of NATO, who've been part of AUKUS, or whatever Five Eyes. If all of a sudden there is a disproportionate access to artificial intelligence that is no longer available to allies, then we need to get a fire under us to start moving towards sort of implementation of AI, sovereign AI technology, and what that could potentially look like.
So I remember we walked in to record and you were just kind of like chattering about it. And obviously like you're always thinking and there's always ideas coming up, but you were so intense on it. And that ran right into this thing that I've been ruminating on for a while, which is around this idea of like in progressive kind of left spaces, we have like perfected the art of critique and deconstruction, and I think that's really important. But something I think we are less good at is painting the picture of the beautiful thing we can all run towards. And so I'm really thinking about and digging in, and it's gonna come up in my dissertation next year, of like, what is the ethical obligation of hope as a practice if you are someone who is participating and trying to create change? And so when you were talking about it, I was like, it's so interesting, and I've been thinking about this. And you and I have been loud critics of kind of the lack of regulation, which obviously took a pivot last week. And so my kind of provocation was to you was, can we do it? And I'm going to write the hopeful story. So like, for me, it was a bit of a love letter to like my adoptive home of like, what's everything I wish Australia could do because of the things that are uniquely Australian. So how do we, like I gave a talk in June at AI Engineer called like Fair Go AI. And I talked about this idea of like, our egalitarianism is our collaborative advantage, not our competitive one. And so the kind of making our own luck side of the Australia 2032 project was not necessarily meant to be like, this is the specific policy proposals, but it was meant to be a bit provocative to say, this is what we could do with who we are and the resources that we have. And obviously we'd been cooking it for a while. And then when we heard that Albo's speech was dropping on Wednesday, we said, well, that's the time to drop it. And obviously, we did a bit of finessing to make it of the moment, the fork sitting in Sydney, July 2016.
I think you've jumped a bit there because we were talking about 2031.
Okay.
In that conversation, when you and I were like just sort of diving in and like, what is the opportunity that AI could bring to Australia, and what does that history look like, and what could that future history look like? And then earlier in the week, because we were kind of looking around 2031
we've been talking about sovereignty, like it was in the.
And so when we saw that format, we're like, oh, let's do an Australian version. Like, I think that this is a really good opportunity for us to kind of create something that's of Australia, that has Australian considerations embedded. And we were having that conversation, and then earlier in the week, we had heard that Albo is about to do a presentation. So I was just going back to give a bit of narrative context.
And I will say, like, I heard this speech, and I didn't see it live because I was in a meeting, and I had Claude running every 45 minutes, waiting for the transcript to come up online, and like send it to my phone. And I was cautiously optimistic. Like, I wanted to hope for the best because, like, energetically that's good. But when I read it, my initial response was, I was astonished at how much of the language, minus not enough labor rights issues, mirrored like that hopeful side in a way that was so unexpected for me. Like, I genuinely expected his position to land more on kind of the warning side of the project. Or
the fear around inaction. Productivity, that kind of sway.
Well, and I think with, my continuing frustration, not with like the Productivity Commission itself, but the idea that has been seen as the thing, whereas the idea that there's productivity and other things. And so going back to this collaborative idea, that I don't think we set that off the table. I think we set it next to other things that are equally as important. And so obviously, I think we've all been digesting and watching many big pieces of machinery move since Wednesday. And
so both Simon, who is our producer behind the camera, but we were sitting inside the office and got a room, and we were watching it live and literally whooping.
Yes.
It was so inspiring, the connection that he was making, first of all, to the kind of grand movements that have happened inside Australia, the kind of progressive politics regarding Medicare, regarding
8-hour workday,
8-hour workday,
the Australian ballot.
It was so beautifully formed in that sort of speech writing aspect that gave this sort of level of hope, and we can own something inside this space which is truly Australian, which is fair go. And how do we actually create a system of this new emerging technology, but also be at the forefront of how it can be done in respect with people, with community, and with Earth? Like, how do we do this sustainably?
Totally. And I think for me, the shift, and I am very biased, right? Because no one loves a place more than an immigrant. I think that chose to go there. But it felt like the first moment that I've seen in the AI discussion here where someone looked at Australia and said, we have something special. We're not going to try to be somewhere else or compete with somewhere else. We're going to be us, because us is the thing that is the advantage. Mm-hmm. And it felt like such a profound shift. And there was even a couple of moments in the language, shout out to the amazing speech writing team, where it almost leaned like religious and spiritual in a way that I thought was so remarkable in a head of state speech.
But he referred to Pope Leo's speech as part of it. So he was leaning into that there are questions that can't be answered by AI, and this is how it leans into, like, spirituality is one element, but also just the sense of community and the sense of like human connection. And these are the answers, like these are the questions that AI can't answer. So I thought that, it does tap into this like human aspect and hope and vision, which is just something that we haven't seen in a lot of leaders. Obviously, big asterisks, because there's a whole heap of emerging American leaders, Mamdani to be one, but there are obviously a whole heap of them that are kind of emerging, and even Andy Burnham, like in UK, like this politics of hope that's coming through at the moment. One, it's so needed in reflection of what's happening elsewhere in the world. But also I think it's a strategic advantage politically, because people are sick of hearing just bad stories regarding everything. And I think that tolerance for giving people, air to actually win, or just give them some space for grace. Like, go have the vision. I'd rather you do that than undersell and give us something that's really crappy and uninspiring, and we're just going to take on American tech and do it. That's obviously also a complete risk. We are talking about vision, not implementation, but the posturing was correct, and I feel that it means that a lot more people can be a lot more outspoken about it.
Yeah, and I think some of the critique I've heard, which I hold well, but I kind of say, let's wait, with my like speck of cynicism, is people go, but he didn't make any concrete promises. And I actually think that's totally excusable, because the political function of that speech is to reset the Overton window of how we discuss the topic. Like, the purpose of that is normative signaling. It's not getting something done. And to me, the thing, as someone who studied democratic bureaucracy for years, is the fact that he gave a timeline. And that timeline in some ways terrifies me, because the idea of like a bill coming in early 2027, like, yes, I think it's urgent and we actually do need regulation at that pace, but that means there is probably 60 days from last week, when the key provisions are getting written and agreed, to start moving them through the bureaucracy to get them to the Senate. And so I am concerned, because I think, I don't remember which paper it was, talked about like at the same time that we're talking about this, like, what is a hopey, changey vibe, also saying like, hey, Anthropic, we're open for business. And so my question will be, how many teeth does the bill have? And we can't know that yet. But what I would say is, like, now is the moment, if anyone here is listening, call your minister. Tell them like what you think, because they are all going to be making calls to Canberra for the next 60 days and taking briefings. And so I think there's a moment, but I think the level of urgency is like 2027 is the date something goes to the legislature. Decisions are getting made in the next 60 days.
Yeah, 100%. But I also think that it's also really hard to come as a creator, to come with a blank slate. And so going to MPs right now, particularly if you have some level of AI expertise or you're working with AI inside your organisation, they do not have the same experience that you do. So go and be having conversations. I mean, like, this is how it's impacted my industry. This is the concerns that I have. And give them some level of narrative context to what is the potential for if this doesn't happen right. And that's the thing, because I think I always have this sort of saying, is like, a lot of people want to be creators, but they're actually editors. They only come in after something's there and then rail against it, or like boost it up. It's more like, this is an opportunity to really use critical thinking about how AI is affecting you and your industry, and coming with some level of proactive movement in that space.
And one thing I would say about a word you used that I just want to clarify for folks listening is, you talked about expertise. And one of the problems in our world, certainly, we have expertise in that, we're on the tools and studying it every day. If you are the recipient of an AI usage mandate, you have expertise in the worker's experience with AI. So I want to be really clear that expertise, both in terms of like the academic or professional implementation sense, but also as an end user of this technology, that is important expertise that our ministers need to hear from. So I just want to say that all of that expertise is critical right now.
Absolutely.
And one shouldn't be privileged over the other. Because I think, again, when we say expertise, it's often this kind of professional knowledge, and all of it's valid.
I really thank you for the clarification, because that would absolutely be my definition of it, is if you're a nurse working with AI systems and you find that they're, for example, inaccurate, or they're providing slight deviation, these are the conversations that need to be had. It's like, okay, what systems do we need to be putting in place to make sure that we're capturing, and like, I'm not suggesting that we all inundate, MPs with gripes, but it's more the fact of, you have an understanding of how this is influencing your industry. If you have any sort of visibility as to what that looks like in 5 years' time, or even 6 months' time, like, I know 5 years is hard to kind of imagine, but even 6 months' time, what does this mean? Does this mean that you feel disempowered as part of your engagement inside the workforce? Does it mean that you actually have more time and like create the level of depth regarding different industries? I think that's an important thing for people to have context of.
Yeah, I think so, because it goes back to one of the things that I'll tie in a bit of a critique of Albo's speech. Obviously, we had an episode on labor rights recently, is I thought it was breathtaking. Like I genuinely, I was walking around my apartment listening to like the recording of the speech when I actually properly got to listen. And when he said like anything less is theft, like as someone who studied global politics, for a head of state to say that to these enormous companies is so radical that I think if you live in a progressive space, to see a head of state say it, you may not understand like how radical that is. But he didn't take the same kind of aggressive human rights towards labor. And so that is a gap that ACTU and other unions have come out and said, like, we want more than what you've given us. But I think
I do think the thing to consider there, and just to push back on that a little bit, and
I love when you argue with me.
but also just like, I don't disagree, because I do think there's a lot of issues with the report that came from Department of Workplace. So they released that in the week before, I think, and like as part of that report, a lot of the conversation was regarding, okay, what is the impact to workplace? Oh, we're not seeing it manifest as a negative response to employment. We're not seeing it like as a reduction in employment. We're seeing that there's, things happening inside certain industries. Those industries hopefully will be able to self-rectify and move them along. But what that report didn't really sort of take into account is job quality, how people are feeling about their work. They're going, okay, are people employed? Are they not? That's kind of probably a different dynamic. And also, at the moment, we're seeing impacts across industries, and typically those people, like the conversations are now, are those people redeploying in kind of different, like the way off that's kind of happening at the moment are people in industries that are heavily affected, more significantly women. Lots of administrative roles and all that type of stuff are being affected. But what are they moving into? They're moving into care roles, or they're moving into others that maybe has a more long tail opportunity and future within it, but those impacts haven't really been considered. So I think the reason why I say that is a reason why I think there was a bit of a sort of foot off the pedal in that regard, was because that report had come out the week before. And so I'm sure that if that had more teeth inside of it, it would be echoed inside the speech.
I think that's right. And I think your point about job quality is really important. So there was a couple months ago, a report that came out from Glean, which is like an AI sort of enterprise search knowledge management kind of company growing like gangbusters. And what they showed, I've cited it, I think, in my newsletter, talked about the number of people who are being forced to use AI who are looking for another job is really, really high. And so I think what that report didn't capture, and what honestly, I'm not really confident, when I'm in boardrooms and I try to like bring up the issues with like how unhappy workers are with being told to adopt AI as the objective, boards, in my experience, are quite disconnected from how unpleasant that is, because these individuals are using it in ways they find helpful, but they're not being mandated to do it. And so their experience is very different than line employees. And so this is related to like Cory Doctorow, who will be in Sydney at the end of August for the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. Talks about, he has a new book called The Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI. And his idea of the reverse centaur is like where the machine's driving and you're just the button pusher who's doing it. It's really uninteresting to humans. And
we're seeing it happening.
Totally.
And that's the problem, is we talk about, and I say, like, we're part of this. We want to be able to see this like future where things are abundant, and we've got like humans are given more time. But the concern is where we're seeing is a lot of the creativity and sort of interesting parts of the role are being divvied off.
Totally.
So it's like, what is your use case selection for when you're using AI?
And again, this goes back to, I feel like I'm a broken record, but like choosing efficiency or productivity as your goal is anti-human creativity and well-being. So if that is your strategic objective, number one, you're probably not going to achieve it. Like, it's not an effective goal setting exercise, but you're probably going to make the people in your organization miserable. So you may be able to get a jump in individual productivity over a short time horizon, but there's so many second and third order effects that are horrific for the business or society that, like, I hope, and because I think regulation's necessary, I think if there were stricter either interpretation of existing labor law or new regulations that kind of thought about things like cognitive erosion, IP rights. Like, we're already seeing a huge jump in workplace health and safety claims around AI brain fry and sort of cognitive overload. That what I'm finding is when I'm bringing that statistic into boardrooms, it's the first time those people are aware that that is a thing that's happening in the world. And so part of the problem is that the product marketing departments of Frontier AI have done a very good job of influencing decision makers and organizations who don't have the context to understand the way that product marketing is actually defeating what they're trying to accomplish. And I think one of the ways that we're going to get there at that level of executives and board members is through regulation, because they're often thinking through a governance, risk, and compliance lens. And so regulation signals something that they should pay attention to. At least in the rooms I'm in, these are not people who are careless.
Yeah.
These are people who are in a context that means they're missing something.
And
so that is my hope, is like, I don't think regulation is the sole answer, but I think if regulation pushes a signal, boards will start to realize that the way it's been talked about is not the effective way to achieve their goals, and it's bad for humans.
Can I think of I know I said this on TikTok recently, but I love it as an abstraction of.
I love everything you say on TikTok. So.
But there's this amazing Danish documentary film called The Five Obstructions, and the whole context of the documentary is a director of this cult short film from the 1960s, actually maybe 1950s. Anyway, he's given all these different, basically, limitations that he has to recreate his film with different kind of constructs around it, different limitations. I know this sounds very
I'm so into this.
It's actually
what am I
really
doing
good
tonight?
So it's a really, really, really good film. But the whole sort of core thesis is that true creativity comes from limitation.
Totally.
And that when you have these things that you're pushing up against and limiters to the situation, you actually get more creative in implementation. So it's one of those things that I think is so deeply interesting, because there's been whole courses towards creative thinking and what does creativity mean? And in a lot of instances, creativity has meant design or aspects of maybe copywriting or different kinds of ideas. Whereas this is we have the opportunity to be deeply creative regarding what limitations we put in place that actually changes the situation, which is what we've seen with the social media ban. By putting that limitation in place, we have seen end result for companies like Apple, who have actually changed their operating model to be able to service children in better ways. Because they're like, you know what, this is probably going to be something that that replicates throughout society, because we are seeing negative effects. And this gives us the opportunity to be front of the herd. How do we actually create a strategic advantage through limitation? I think a lot of these frontier AI tech are actually saying, and I remember this conversation happening in February, they are begging to be regulated.
I mean, Dario and Demas are asking for external safety certification and regulation.
Yeah, exactly. They know what's happening, and if you don't do it, then they aren't constrained, because what the incentive is there is for them to make the most money possible.
Right, and this goes back to my belief that if you're the head of something with that much economic incentive, your personal values don't actually matter. In the sense that they're not going to determine your decisions, so they might as well not exist.
Yeah.
But to get to loop us back to our project, and it is, I actually think one of the fun things about writing 2032 was that coming from a middle power, obviously, having grown up in the hegemon, I actually found it such a more interesting imaginative exercise with power and politics, because in the US, the answer is just, we'll buy it or bomb it.
Yeah.
That is always an option. And for Australia, it isn't. And so the thing that was fun, both in kind of your concerned side as well as the hopeful side, is those constraints actually, two things. One, at least as I was thinking, it was what could we do with the limitations we have, and how do we think of that as an advantage? And one of the things that I'm so just tickled about right now is on WhatsApp this morning at a horrific hour, I was chatting to someone based in Swana, and they were talking about is in it we proposed a middle power coalition. So this very cooperative idea, and the provocation was Canada, Australia, Japan, Korea, and the Netherlands negotiating as a bloc, holding basically all of the choke points of the supply chain that the great powers need. And certainly there's someone in Europe, a nonprofit that's just put out an idea where they basically proposed the same coalition because it makes sense. And I was like, oh my God, someone thinks this thing I made up is possible. But it goes back to this, like, the constraint of not being able to dominate in force requires cooperation, grounded in sort of Carney's Davos provocation. But I'm interested to hear about, in your thinking about that, looking at the world, like, what constraints to you are most generative right now for Australia?
Well, obviously, I think that we've got some power inside rare earths and what access to
lithium.
Yeah. So we can absolutely be using that as a leverage point for what we're doing. Obviously, we don't have control over the supply chain of tech. We're not. But with Netherlands, if Netherlands was part of that block, obviously there's massive amounts of opportunity.
Just for background for folks who aren't aware, the Netherlands have the sole provider of the lithography that is required to manufacture GPUs.
Yeah.
So there is literally one company that holds the entire supply chain hostage if they wanted to.
Yeah, and then also, correct me if I'm wrong, Singapore with the chip design.
Yeah. Singapore chip design. So Singapore is also potentially part of that block. But yes,
you said Singapore, but I also think that, like, to extend that this is part of, like, and I'm also very cognizant that this is sort of old colonial structures that were put in place.
Of course.
But there is an alignment there between middle powers, and rather than everyone kind of, like, I loved what Albanese was saying about the opportunity and what does this mean for us. We can contain and see an element there for responsible AI, how we kind of approach, because we have the social fabric that really enables experimentation inside that space.
Yeah.
A lot of other countries don't. So we can actually put forward or prove or create some level of research regarding those elements that maybe feel a little bit ambitious for countries. Like Europe was going to find that difficult. They would do it, like EU would do it through regulation.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that's a very difficult and unwieldy beast to try and move. Whereas Australia actually is very lithe and movable in terms of how they could own the responsible AI and elements of that kind of thought process.
I think that's right. I mean, one of the things, obviously, with kind of the federated system in Europe, like, you just have stakeholders with different interests and you're trying to coordinate them. People often talk about the fact that, what are we, 27 million people? As a constraint, because we can only have so many engineers out of 27 million. But the fact is we can turn a ship quite quickly. Like Australia and the US are actually geographically the same size, and the number of humans you have to convince to get anything done is much different here.
Yeah.
And so instead of seeing our small population, and I always joke that, like, you're only 3 degrees separation from any other one in the country if you know who to email, like, actually becomes incredibly influential. And the fact that he leaned into the social media ban was so exciting to me, because one of for me, throughout all my work, in the companies that I've been in, I've never been in a company that, like, controlled enough that it could do something. But I always came in with this perspective of, but what we can prove is that something can work at this scale, which removes the excuse from the big players to say it's impossible. And so I, like, the sustainability program at Culture Amp, like, we grounded it in climate equity. And let's just be clear, a SaaS company, of sub 1,000 people, like, is not going to literally change the trajectory of climate. But they could experiment in ways that a big company couldn't and be like, yo, you could do this. And that was our strategy, was do things that were grounded in climate justice, even at a small scale, that proved the idea could be implemented, and then share it. And I think that's the role Australia should be playing.
And I really want us to kind of think about looking at what's happening across Silicon Valley. The reason why 95% of enterprises aren't seeing the benefits of AI is because they're actually saddled with historical bureaucracy, and having something that is movable and people have coordinated areas of expertise.
Yeah.
So a middle powers union could be something like, we cordon off responsibility, we know what each of us plays inside that area, and we can actually innovate quicker. we can go and do the things that we are good at, but then know that we are coordinated as part of that level. And I think that historically we've always kind of had the thought that, okay, the hegemon is something that we can trust, and now that has obviously subsided. And I think that we have to really sort of see US power, Chinese power in the same type of vein, but also talking about Chinese power and seeing what this power distribution could look like. On the back, and it wasn't related to Albanese's speech by any ways, because this was well in the works before then, China released bAIces, W-A-I-C-O.
We're unclear on the pronunciation.
Yeah, not the Texas holdout, not that play, not that bet. It's WAICO, which is the World AI Conference Organization, I believe it is. Anyway, but the whole point is, how do we create a coalition? And in this instance, China was, from what I can see from all press releases, there's been no comment from DFAT, there's been nothing, like no Australian involvement. Totally fine. Like, I can definitely see the coordination level is particularly focused on Global South. What does that look like? And that sort of coalition that's coordinating there is like, how do we create more, more cogs in the machine to try and create impact? Now, obviously, China has a very specific strategy in play. There is, how do we imbue more soft power and communal kind of benefit, particularly inside developing sort of countries as part of that, because like in terms of giving access to AI, this is definitely part and aligned with their ongoing strategy, global sort of dominant, like what that's going to look like strategy. But it is like a very interesting kind of comparison to see what's happening as part of WAICO. The silence that's happening on the Australian front in regards to that, I assumed that at some point there would be multiple parties. There's no one inside this middle powers kind of coalition that we're talking to that are involved. However, why it's really important to us in Australia is it's all of our regional neighbours.
Yeah.
So like, we've got, I think 5 of our kind of, closest members are all part of WAICO. So if we aren't kind of engaging in any way, we have to also admit that means that we will become more and more isolated as part of that engagement.
Yeah, and something just to call out for folks who maybe aren't, thinking about great power politics is, I think the way that, China launching WAICO and the way they're engaging with the Global South is very much an extension of kind of their, what I will call colonial policy history. And that when you look at the US's kind of imperial colonial IR policy, it's very much dominate, subdue, and abstract. Like it's a very hard power kind of approach. Whereas when you look at, for example, Chinese investment in Africa, it's much less about immediate kind of ownership and extraction, and it's actually about investment, building positive sentiment, and then using that later for leverage or to get alignment on something they want to get done. And so it's this very soft power thing. And so I just want to point out that there's some interesting kind of models of colonialism as being inherently extractive that are quite Western, and that there are alternative ways of doing what is partially a colonial project, a very different lens. And
can I just say that's and just to add to that, like we have to also see the success of that was the Marshall Plan. Like
absolutely,
like that was demonstrated from US positioning, right?
Yes.
Like it's one of those things that we need to really kind of consider, that there has been a step change in terms of what that colonial power looks like inside America. And when we're looking at what's happening in China at the moment, they've taken those lessons and they've learned from them. So I get it, like, and 100%. There's a really amazing book on this called The War on Diplomacy by Ronan Farrow. Recommend.
I love Ronan Farrow. I also, the other thing about kind of the Chinese strategy that's quite interesting to me right now is the level of, and I understand that kind of given their governmental structure, they can move faster because they're just lower coordination costs. But things like aggressive regulation of AI anthropomorphism. So the types of things that, autocracies find destabilize, like unhappy people destabilize autocracies. So I can tell a story about why the Chinese would be doing this, but the Chinese are doing some of the most specific and effective, I am going to project, regulation of AI and approaching it from a human safety perspective in the world. And part of that is because China's kind of AI safety ethics regime is a rights-based framework, whereas the West is basically working off of a risk-based framework. And I think that I think risk-based is not good enough. I don't think it gets us to like human flourishing. It's like it feeds into the like, oh, catastrophic harms or like Skynet or AI is going to turn us all into paper clips, and like we try to prevent that, as opposed to like the things that are happening right now that are grounded in people's fundamental rights to dignity. And so, yeah, I'm actually very, very interested to see the ways that that fundamental grounding of that is imbued into these coalitions that are being built. But I think there's green space. If, China is kind of convening the global south, the middle powers, there is open space. And so this is my challenge to everybody in international relations in Canberra is, what calls are you making? And are you leading the charge to get everybody at the same table? Because there's so much that we can do together. But together, to me, is the thing that we've not been operating with that is the only way we're going to get to where we want to go.
Yeah, 100%. And I do think that that's a really good shout out. And if you want to look at Australia 2032 as a model of what could potentially happen inside that space, plus you even got existing conversations happening in there between someone inside government. So you could see the types of networking sort of opportunities that can happen across people in government, in tech, and really sort of create a larger dialogue, not only just a tech wash, but more like how do we see tech as the empowerer of people inside a society.
Yeah, and I think one of my dreams for 2032 is like, if you're sitting in another country, what's that version of you? What year and what's going to happen? How many options do you have? But also, I even want to see, this was kind of a country international level project, but like, tell me the story of that through a regional community in Queensland. Like, I think part of why I was so excited about this is because I wanted to hear other people's ideas. So like, I care less about whether people agree with the vision and more like, what does it provoke in them and how can I get to see and learn that? So, and that goes back to I think this theme is that collaboration and together, and we each need to be working on our own little piece of the puzzle at every kind of set of a scale. There isn't an incorrect one because we are at an absolute inflection point, and we either sprint now and do it now, or things are going to calcify within 6 months.
Join the movement.
Yeah.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?